What if I told you that a single moment at a graduation ceremony would expose a decade-long criminal conspiracy that reached all the way to the Supreme Court? Picture this: Catherine Sterling, 8 months pregnant, standing at the podium after graduating law school magna cum laude. 2,000 people are applauding. Her father, a Supreme Court justice, beams with pride. Everything seems perfect until her husband Rick walks onto that stage. Crack! The sound of his hand striking her face echoes through the auditorium, amplified by her wireless microphone. But this wasn't just domestic violence. It was the beginning of the most shocking federal corruption case in recent history. What the audience didn't know was that Rick had been secretly recording his pregnant wife for months, stalking his ex-wife for 7 years, and using his marriage to gain inside information about Supreme Court decisions. His first wife had lost her baby after he pushed her down the stairs, and now he was planning the same fate for Catherine. But Rick made one critical mistake. He underestimated the power of truth when it's witnessed by 2,000 people and recorded on dozens of phones. This is the incredible true story of how one woman's courage to speak up brought down a criminal empire and changed federal law forever. Stay with me, because what happens next will shock you. Crack! The sound of Rick's hand against Kate's face echoed through the silent auditorium as 2,000 graduation guests froze in shock. Catherine Sterling had imagined this moment 1,000 times during her 3 grueling years of law school, but never like this. Standing at the podium with her 8 months pregnant belly barely concealed beneath her graduation gown, she touched her bleeding lip with trembling fingers, while the stunned silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 30 seconds earlier, everything had been perfect. Dean Patricia Walsh had just called her name. Catherine Elizabeth Sterling, graduating magna cum laude. The crowd had erupted in applause. Her father, Supreme Court Justice William Sterling, had risen from his seat in the VIP section, his weathered face beaming with pride as cameras flashed. Her mother Margaret sat beside him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Even her best friend Rachel had whooped from the graduate section, pumping her fist in the air. Kate had approached the podium with her prepared speech, the one she'd practiced in the mirror for weeks. She was supposed to thank her professors, acknowledge her classmates, and gracefully mention the challenges of completing law school while pregnant. Instead, when she reached the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, her heart had swelled with a different kind of gratitude. "Thank you," she had begun, her voice clear and strong. "3 years ago, I began this journey not knowing if I had what it takes to become a lawyer. Today, I stand here 8 months pregnant, proof that women can do anything we set our minds to. But I couldn't have done this without my father, Justice William Sterling, who taught me that the law exists to protect those who cannot protect themselves." That's when Rick had moved. Her husband of 2 years had been sitting in the front row, supposedly the picture of a supportive spouse. He'd been taking photos with his phone, holding her purse, even helping her adjust her graduation cap before the ceremony. But Kate had noticed the signs: the sharp scent of whiskey on his breath, the tight set of his jaw when she mentioned her father, the way his corporate smile had faltered when the crowd applauded her academic achievements. Richard Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, wasn't used to playing second fiddle to anyone, especially not his pregnant wife. "You didn't thank me," he had hissed as she stepped down from the podium, diploma in hand. "Your husband, the man paying for this ridiculous degree you'll never use." "Rick, please," Kate had whispered, acutely aware that hundreds of people were watching them. "We can talk about this later." But later wasn't soon enough for Rick's wounded ego. As the dean began calling the next name, Rick's voice had risen above the respectful murmur of the crowd. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Standing up there, embarrassing me with your conditions showing, thanking Daddy instead of the man who actually supports you." "Rick, stop," Kate had pleaded, her free hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "Please, not here." That's when his hand had connected with her face. Not a momentary loss of control, but a calculated strike designed to remind her who held the power in their marriage. The crack of palm against cheek reverberated through the sound system, amplified by her wireless microphone that she'd forgotten to remove. Now in the aftermath, time seemed suspended. 2,000 people sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether they'd actually witnessed what they thought they'd seen. Phone cameras that had been recording graduation memories suddenly became evidence of assault. Dean Walsh stood paralyzed at the podium, her mouth open in shock. But it was Justice Sterling's reaction that would later be replayed on every news channel in America. The distinguished jurist, known for his measured temperament and careful words, rose slowly from his seat. His voice, trained by decades of courtroom authority, cut through the stunned silence like a blade. "Nobody move. This is now a crime scene." Those 7 words transformed everything. What might have been dismissed as a private marital dispute became a public legal matter, witnessed by thousands and recorded by dozens. Rick's corporate instincts kicked in immediately. Damage control, spin management, crisis communication. But he was operating in a world where his usual tools held no power. "It was an accident," Rick said loudly, his voice carrying clearly in the silent auditorium. "My wife tripped. I was trying to steady her." But the video footage told a different story. 50 phones had captured the moment from different angles, and there was no ambiguity in the evidence. Rick's deliberate movement, the force of the blow, Kate's shocked stumble backward, it was all there in high definition. Security guards began moving toward the stage, but Justice Sterling's authoritative presence commanded the scene. "Call 911, he instructed Dean Walsh, never taking his eyes off his daughter. "Medical attention first, then police." Kate stood trembling, one hand on her swollen belly, the other touching her split lip. The baby was moving frantically inside her, responding to her elevated heart rate and stress hormones. Around her, the careful choreography of graduation day dissolved into chaos. Margaret Sterling was already pushing through the crowd, her prosecutor's instincts overriding her maternal emotions. She'd spent 20 years in criminal law before becoming a judge's wife, and she recognized the signs of escalating domestic violence when she saw them. "Catherine, sweetheart, are you hurt? Is the baby okay?" Margaret's voice was steady and professional, though her hands shook as she examined her daughter's face. Rick attempted to approach them, his expression shifting between manufactured concern and barely controlled anger. "This is ridiculous. It was an accident. Kate, tell them it was an accident." But Kate couldn't speak. The shock of public humiliation combined with the physical pain and her fear for the baby had left her speechless. She stared at her husband and this man she'd married believing he loved her, and saw a stranger wearing Rick's face. Dean Walsh's voice crackled through the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're suspending the ceremony. Please remain in your seats while we address this situation." The paramedics arrived first, their professional calm a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere in the auditorium. They checked Kate's vital signs, assessed the baby's heartbeat, and confirmed that both mother and child appeared stable. But stable didn't mean safe, and everyone in that room understood the difference. Detective James Morrison arrived within 10 minutes, his weathered face taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. He'd handled domestic violence cases for 15 years, but never one with quite this many witnesses or this level of public scrutiny. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said gently, approaching Kate with the careful respect reserved for victims of violence. "I'm Detective Morrison. Can you tell me what happened here?" Rick stepped forward before Kate could answer. "Detective, this has been blown completely out of proportion. My wife is pregnant and emotional. She stumbled, I tried to help her, and people misunderstood what they saw." But Detective Morrison had already spoken with 3 witnesses, reviewed 2 different video recordings, and assessed the physical evidence. The redness on Kate's cheek was consistent with an open-hand slap, not a steadying grab. Her defensive posture, the way she unconsciously leaned away from her husband, told its own story. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," Morrison told Rick. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you able to answer some questions?" Kate nodded slowly, finding her voice. "He hit me, in front of everyone. He hit me because I thanked my father in my speech instead of him." The words hung in the air like an accusation and a revelation combined. This wasn't about a stumble or an accident. This was about power, control, and a man who believed his wife's achievements somehow diminished his own status. Rick's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You're being dramatic, Kate. Everyone knows you're emotional lately because of the pregnancy. This is exactly the kind of instability I've been worried about." It was the wrong thing to say in front of a detective trained to recognize manipulation tactics. Morrison had heard abusers use pregnancy as a weapon before. claiming their victims were too hormonal or unstable to be credible witnesses to their own abuse. Justice Sterling approached the group with measured steps, his judicial training warring with his paternal instincts. Detective Morrison, I want to be clear about something. I am this woman's father, and I recognize that creates certain complications. But I am also an officer of the court, and I witnessed a crime being committed. I'm prepared to make a formal statement as a witness. The implications were staggering. A Supreme Court justice serving as a witness in a domestic violence case involving his own daughter would create unprecedented legal and ethical challenges. But Justice Sterling's commitment to the law superseded even his family relationships, a principle that would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. As the auditorium slowly emptied under police supervision, Kate remained at the center of a growing storm. Her graduation day, meant to celebrate 3 years of academic achievement and the promise of a legal career ahead, had become the day her private hell became public knowledge. But in the midst of shock and humiliation, something else began to emerge. For the first time in 2 years of marriage, Kate wasn't alone with Rick's anger. There were witnesses now. There was evidence. There was help. The perfect day had indeed been shattered, but sometimes breaking is the first step toward freedom. Security guards rushed toward Rick as Kate touched her bleeding lip, but Justice Sterling's voice cut through the chaos like a gavel striking wood. Nobody move. This is now a crime scene. The auditorium buzzed with whispers and the clicking of phone cameras as Dean Walsh's voice echoed through the sound system. The graduation ceremony is hereby suspended. Please remain in your seats while authorities address this situation. Kate felt disconnected from her own body, as if she were watching the scene unfold from somewhere above the stage. The baby kicked frantically against her ribs, responding to her racing heartbeat and flood of stress hormones. She pressed her palm against her belly, trying to calm both herself and the child within. "Ma'am, we need to check you and the baby," said one of the paramedics, a kind-faced woman in her 40s. "Can you sit down for me?" They guided Kate to a chair that had been quickly arranged on the stage. The paramedic checked her pulse, blood pressure, and used a portable fetal monitor to assess the baby's condition. The rhythmic whoosh-whoosh of the heartbeat filled the tense air, a sound that should have been comforting, but instead highlighted how much danger they might both be in. "Baby sounds good," the paramedic reported. "Strong heartbeat, normal rhythm, but you're showing signs of acute stress. Any cramping, contractions, unusual pain?" Kate shook her head, though her entire body felt like it was vibrating with tension. "Just scared. He's never done anything like this in public before." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Detective Morrison immediately stepped closer. "Mrs. Blackwood, when you say in public, are you telling me this has happened in private?" Rick's voice boomed across the stage. "Don't answer that, Kate. You're clearly in shock, and anything you say now could be misunderstood later." But Kate was tired of Rick speaking for her, making decisions for her, controlling every aspect of their life together. For 2 years, she'd convinced herself that his possessiveness was love, his criticism was helpful guidance, his isolation of her from friends and family was natural for a new marriage. The sting on her cheek and the shocked faces of 2,000 witnesses had shattered those careful justifications. "He's very controlling," she told Detective Morrison quietly. "He monitors my phone calls, my emails, where I go. He says it's because he loves me, but it feels like—" She struggled for the word. "Like I'm his property." Margaret Sterling had reached the stage and immediately positioned herself between Rick and her daughter. Her years as a prosecutor had taught her to recognize the signs of escalating domestic violence, and everything about Rick's behavior, his alternating attempts at charm and intimidation, his efforts to control the narrative, his complete lack of concern for Kate's well-being, fit the pattern perfectly. "Detective Morrison," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in criminal courtrooms, "I've observed my son-in-law's behavior toward my daughter for the past 2 years. What happened here today is consistent with a pattern of controlling and emotionally abusive behavior." Rick's face darkened with rage. "You people are unbelievable. I provide for Kate, I support her dreams, I pay for her education, and this is how you repay me? By turning a simple accident into some kind of conspiracy against me?" Mr. Blackwood, Detective Morrison said, his tone remaining professionally neutral. I've reviewed 3 different video recordings of the incident. There was nothing accidental about your actions. Justice Sterling approached the group with careful, measured steps. His presence commanded respect even in this chaotic situation, but Kate could see the struggle in his eyes. As a judge, he understood the importance of remaining impartial and allowing the legal process to unfold. As a father, he wanted to wrap his daughter in his arms and promise that no one would ever hurt her again. Catherine, he said softly, using her full name as he had when she was a child in trouble. I need you to know that what happened here today was not your fault. You have done nothing wrong. Those simple words broke something inside Kate that had been straining for months. Tears began flowing down her cheeks, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had told her she'd done nothing wrong. In Rick's world, everything was her fault. If he was angry, she'd provoked it. If he was disappointed, she'd failed him. If he was embarrassed, she'd humiliated him. Dean Walsh approached the group, her graduation regalia seeming absurd in the current circumstances. Catherine, I want you to know that the entire law school community stands behind you. What happened here today? Well, it's exactly why we need more women in law. To stand up to men who believe they're above accountability. Rick's corporate attorneys would later argue that Dean Walsh's statement represented bias that prejudiced any potential legal proceedings. But in that moment, her support meant everything to a young woman who'd been isolated from her own support network for 2 years. I want to press charges, Kate said suddenly, the words emerging with surprising clarity and strength. I want to press charges against my husband for assault. The statement sent ripples through the remaining crowd of witnesses. Rick's face went white, then red with fury. Kate, you don't mean that. You're upset, you're pregnant, you're not thinking clearly. But Kate had never been thinking more clearly in her life. I mean it. He hit me in front of 2,000 people because I thanked my father instead of him in a speech. If he'll do that here, in public, what will he do when we're alone? Detective Morrison nodded approvingly. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm going to need you to come to the station to make a formal statement. Are you feeling well enough to do that, or would you prefer to wait until tomorrow? I can do it now, Kate said, though her voice was shaky. I want to do it now, while it's fresh, while I have courage. Rick made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. This is insane. Kate, think about what you're doing. Think about our baby, our marriage, your future. Do you really want to destroy our family over one moment of misunderstanding? But Justice Sterling stepped forward, and when he spoke, it was with the full weight of his judicial authority. Mr. Blackwood, you have just committed assault in front of multiple witnesses, including officers of the court. The legal process will now take its course, regardless of your personal preferences or your attempts to manipulate the victim. Margaret Sterling wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Catherine, your father and I will support you through whatever comes next. You're not alone anymore. As they prepared to leave the auditorium, Kate's friend Rachel pushed through the crowd of remaining graduates. Kate, oh my God, are you okay? I can't believe... I always thought Rick was controlling, but I never imagined... You thought he was controlling? Kate asked, surprised by the admission. Rachel looked uncomfortable. Well, yeah. The way he always had to know where you were, how he'd call or text constantly during study groups, how you stopped coming to social events. I wanted to say something, but you seemed happy, and I didn't want to interfere in your marriage. It was a common refrain among friends and family of abuse victims. The signs were there, but no one wanted to interfere in a private relationship. Kate realized she'd been sending mixed signals, covering for Rick's behavior, making excuses for his jealousy and possessiveness, even as they slowly strangled her independence. As they walked toward the exit, Detective Morrison fell into step beside them. Mrs. Blackwood, I want you to understand something important. This case isn't just about domestic violence anymore. Because your father is a Supreme Court justice, and because the assault took place in such a public forum, there may be federal implications to consider. Kate didn't fully understand what he meant, but she could see her parents exchanging meaningful glances. Her father's position, which had always been a source of pride and protection, was about to make their family situation infinitely more complicated. Behind them, Rick was already on his phone with his attorneys, his voice carrying across the emptying auditorium. I don't care what it costs. This situation needs to disappear immediately. Whatever it takes to make this go away quietly. But some things can't be bought, and some silences can't be purchased. The video of Rick striking his pregnant wife at her graduation ceremony was already spreading across social media, shared by outraged witnesses who'd captured the moment on their phones. By the time they reached the police station, de jure justice for Kate was beginning to trend on multiple platforms. The perfect day had become a public reckoning, and there was no going back to the carefully maintained silence that had protected Rick's reputation and preserved Kate's marriage. The truth, like the red mark on Kate's cheek, was now visible for everyone to see. As they prepared to enter the police station, Justice Sterling placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Catherine, what happens next won't be easy, but remember what I taught you about justice. It's not always convenient and it's rarely comfortable, but it's always necessary." Kate nodded, feeling the baby shift inside her, as if responding to the promise of protection and accountability that lay ahead. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like she could breathe freely. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to understand something," Detective Morrison said gently as they settled into the interview room at the police station. "This wasn't just domestic violence. This was assault with hundreds of witnesses, and your father's position makes this potentially a federal matter." Kate sat in the hard plastic chair, still wearing her graduation gown, her cap long since discarded. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, making the red mark on her cheek appear even more pronounced. Her mother sat beside her, having insisted on being present as both support and legal counsel. "Federal?" Kate asked, confused. "I don't understand. Rick hit me. It's assault, maybe domestic violence, but federal?" Detective Morrison exchanged glances with Margaret Sterling before explaining. "When someone assaults the family member of a federal judge, especially in such a public manner, it raises questions about potential intimidation or coercion related to judicial proceedings. We have to investigate whether this was an isolated incident of domestic violence or part of a broader pattern that might influence your father's judicial decisions." The implications were staggering. Kate had never considered that her husband's behavior might be seen as an attempt to manipulate Supreme Court decisions through intimidation of a justice's family member. But as she thought about Rick's increasing anger over her father's influence in her life, his resentment of the Sterling family's legal prominence, and his belief that he should control every aspect of their marriage, the possibility didn't seem far-fetched. "Detective Morrison," Margaret said in her crisp prosecutor's voice, "before we proceed, I need to know, are you treating my daughter as a victim or as a potential tool in a federal investigation?" "She's absolutely a victim, Your Honor," Morrison replied, using Margaret's former judicial title out of respect. "But we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Mrs. Blackwood, can you tell me about your husband's attitude toward your father's position on the Supreme Court?" Kate thought carefully before answering. "Rick has always been... jealous isn't the right word. Resentful, maybe? He thinks my family looks down on him because he's in business rather than law. He's made comments about my father's cases, especially ones involving corporate regulations or business rights." "What kind of comments?" "He says my father is part of an elitist legal establishment that doesn't understand how the real world works. Sometimes when there's a Supreme Court decision that affects business, Rick will make comments about how nice it would be if the justices had to consider the impact on actual working people." Detective Morrison made notes as she spoke. "Has he ever suggested that you should influence your father's thinking on cases?" Kate's stomach clenched as she remembered several uncomfortable conversations. "Not directly, but yes, I think so. He's made comments about how I should help my father understand the business perspective on certain issues. He suggested I should arrange dinners or social meetings where he could educate my father about economic realities." Margaret Sterling's face had grown increasingly grim during this exchange. As a former prosecutor, she understood the serious implications of what her daughter was describing. If Rick had been attempting to use his marriage to gain access to or influence over a Supreme Court justice, his actions today might represent the escalation of a much broader conspiracy. "Catherine," her mother said carefully, "has Rick ever asked you specific questions about your father's work?" About cases he's considering or decisions he's making? The memory hit Kate like a physical blow. The pregnancy announcement. Oh my God, the pregnancy announcement. Both Detective Morrison and Margaret leaned forward. What about the pregnancy announcement? Morrison asked. We announced my pregnancy at a family dinner 3 months ago. There was a case your father was considering then. Kate looked at her mother. Something about reproductive rights and corporate health insurance coverage. Rick kept asking detailed questions about how my father was leaning, what the other justices were thinking. I thought he was just making conversation, but he was trying to get inside information about a pending Supreme Court case. Margaret finished, her voice tight with controlled anger. Detective Morrison's radio crackled, and he stepped away briefly to take a call. When he returned, his expression was even more serious than before. Mrs. Blackwood, I have some disturbing news. We've been conducting background checks on your husband as part of this investigation. Kate's heart began racing. What kind of background checks? This isn't Rick's first incident. We've discovered a sealed record from his previous marriage that ended 7 years ago. The world seemed to tilt around Kate. Previous marriage? Rick told me I was his first wife. Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. What happened in the previous marriage, Detective? Morrison consulted his notes grimly. His first wife, Jennifer Walsh, was hospitalized twice during their 2-year marriage. Once for a broken wrist that she claimed resulted from falling downstairs. The second time for injuries consistent with being pushed or shoved, though she refused to press charges. Kate felt sick. What happened to her? The marriage ended when she was 6 months pregnant. She had what was officially classified as a miscarriage, but the medical records suggest the fetal death was consistent with trauma to the abdomen. Again, she refused to press charges, but she divorced him immediately afterward and moved to another state. The interview room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Kate struggled to process what she was hearing. The man she'd married, the father of her unborn child, had potentially killed a previous unborn child through violence against his first wife. Where is she now? Kate whispered. Jennifer. We're working on locating her. She changed her name after the divorce and has been very careful to stay under the radar. But Mrs. Blackwood, this information changes the scope of our investigation significantly. We're not just looking at today's assault anymore. We're looking at a potential pattern of escalating violence toward pregnant women. Margaret Sterling stood up, her prosecutor instincts taking over completely. Detective Morrison, I need to know what protective measures you're putting in place for my daughter immediately. If Rick has a history of violence toward pregnant wives, Catherine and her baby are in serious danger. We're working on a restraining order, but that's just paper. Given the circumstances and the potential federal implications, we're coordinating with the U.S. Marshals Service to ensure proper protection for your family. Kate's head was spinning with the rapid escalation of events. This morning she'd been a law school graduate excited to start her career. Now she was potentially a federal witness in a case involving judicial intimidation and domestic terrorism. There's something else, Detective Morrison continued. Rick's corporate attorneys have already been in contact with the district attorney's office. They're not just handling the assault case, they're preparing a comprehensive legal strategy that appears to involve discrediting you as a witness. What do you mean? Kate asked. They're arguing that your pregnancy makes you emotionally unstable, that your father's position creates bias in the investigation, and that the public nature of the incident represents a conspiracy to damage Rick's reputation and business interests. Margaret Sterling's laugh was bitter and knowing. Classic abuser tactics. When they can't control the victim anymore, they try to destroy her credibility. Detective Morrison nodded. There's more. They've filed preliminary divorce papers that include a custody arrangement giving Rick full custody of your child upon birth, based on claims that you're mentally unstable and under the undue influence of your family's political agenda. Kate felt like she was drowning. Can they do that? Can they take my baby? Not without a fight, Margaret said fiercely. Catherine, you need to understand that Rick is playing a very sophisticated game here. He's using his wealth, his corporate connections, and his legal team to try to intimidate you into backing down from the assault charges. But we have evidence, Kate protested. Hundreds of witnesses, video recordings. Evidence can be disputed, witnesses can be discredited, and video can be explained away by expensive attorneys, Detective Morrison said grimly. Rick is betting that you'll choose to protect your child and your family's reputation over pursuing justice for what he did to you today. Kate looked down at her swollen belly, feeling the baby moving restlessly inside her. 2 hours ago, she'd been thinking about names and nursery decorations. Now she was facing a choice between justice and custody of her own child. "Detective Morrison," she said slowly, "what happens if I refuse to back down? What happens if I pursue this case regardless of the consequences?" Morrison's expression was serious but respectful. "Then we fight. We investigate every aspect of Rick's behavior. We locate and interview Jennifer Walsh. We examine his business practices for evidence of intimidation or coercion. And we build a case that protects not just you, but potentially other women who might become his victims in the future." Margaret Sterling placed both hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Catherine, your father and I will support whatever decision you make. But remember what we taught you about courage. It's not the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear, because the cause is just." Kate closed her eyes and felt the baby kick against her ribs, as if urging her forward. When she opened them again, her voice was steady and determined. "Let's fight. Let's build the case. And let's find Jennifer Walsh." Outside the police station, Rick was already implementing his own strategy, unaware that his carefully hidden past was about to become very public knowledge. The battle for truth, justice, and the safety of 2 generations of women was just beginning. Attorney Sarah Beth Coleman delivered devastating news 3 days later as she spread legal documents across the conference table in her downtown office. "Rick's prenuptial agreement isn't just about money, Kate. There's a clause that gives him full custody if you're deemed mentally unstable. And he's already filed papers claiming your father's involvement proves you're unfit." Kate stared at the papers, her 8.5 months pregnant body making it difficult to lean forward comfortably. The prenup she'd signed 2 years earlier, in a haze of romantic excitement, now read like a carefully constructed trap, each clause designed to ensure Rick maintained absolute control over every aspect of their relationship. "I don't understand," Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How can he claim I'm mentally unstable? I just graduated law school magna cum laude." Sarah Beth, a sharp-featured woman in her late 30s who specialized in high-stakes family law, had seen these tactics before. "He's arguing that your decision to involve your father in legal proceedings demonstrates poor judgment and emotional instability. His attorneys are painting a picture of a pregnant woman who can't think for herself and is being manipulated by her politically motivated family." Margaret Sterling, who had insisted on attending this meeting, studied the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 20 years in criminal law. "This is character assassination disguised as legal strategy. Rick is trying to destroy Catherine's credibility before she can testify against him in the assault case." "It gets worse," Sarah Beth continued, pulling out another folder. "Detective Morrison shared some information with me that Rick's team doesn't know we have yet. Rick has been secretly recording conversations with you for months, Kate. Phone calls, private discussions, even arguments. He's building a case that you're emotionally unstable and influenced by your father's political agenda." The blood drained from Kate's face. "Recording me? How is that legal?" "In this state, it's legal if one party consents to the recording," Sarah Beth explained. "Rick has been documenting what he claims is evidence of your instability, but what actually sounds like a man systematically breaking down his pregnant wife's self-confidence." Kate tried to remember all the private conversations she'd had with Rick over the past months. How many times had she expressed doubts about her abilities, fears about motherhood, concerns about balancing family and career? In the context of a normal marriage, these would be natural anxieties shared between spouses. In Rick's hands, they became evidence of mental instability. "There's something else," Sarah Beth said, her voice taking on a more ominous tone. "We've been investigating Rick's business practices as part of building your defense. What we've found suggests this goes far beyond domestic violence." Detective Morrison entered the conference room at that moment, carrying a thick file and wearing the grim expression of someone who'd uncovered information he wished he hadn't found. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, taking a seat across from her, "we've made contact with Jennifer Walsh, Rick's first wife. She's agreed to speak with us, but she's terrified. She's been living under an assumed name for 7 years, and she believes Rick has been having her monitored." Kate's hand instinctively moved to protect her belly. Monitored how? Financial surveillance, mostly. Someone has been tracking her credit reports, employment records, and address changes. She's moved 4 times in 7 years, always because she felt like she was being watched. Margaret Sterling's prosecutor instincts were fully activated now. Detective Morrison, are you telling us that Rick has been stalking his ex-wife for 7 years? That suggests a level of obsession and control that goes far beyond normal domestic violence. That's exactly what I'm telling you. And Jennifer's story about her pregnancy, it wasn't a miscarriage. Rick pushed her down a flight of stairs when she was 6 months pregnant because she threatened to leave him. The baby died, and she nearly did too. The room fell silent except for the sound of Kate's labored breathing. She was looking at her future, or what her future could become if Rick's pattern of escalating violence continued unchecked. Sarah Beth leaned forward. Jennifer is willing to testify, but she needs protection. Rick's corporate resources give him the ability to make people disappear, financially if not physically. Detective Morrison nodded. We're working with federal authorities to provide witness protection for Jennifer. Her testimony, combined with the medical records we've recovered and the evidence of ongoing surveillance, paints a picture of systematic abuse and intimidation that spans nearly a decade. But there's a complication, Sarah Beth continued. Rick's legal team has made a preemptive strike. They filed a motion claiming that any testimony from Jennifer is irrelevant because it predates your marriage and therefore has no bearing on your current situation. They're also arguing that Jennifer is an unreliable witness because of her history of mental health treatment following the loss of her baby. Kate felt like she was suffocating under the weight of Rick's manipulations. Even 7 years later, he was using Jennifer's trauma as a weapon against her credibility. How does he have access to her mental health records? That's what we're trying to figure out, Detective Morrison said grimly. Either his investigators are very good at finding information that should be sealed, or Rick has connections that run deeper than we initially realized. The baby kicked hard against Kate's ribs, as if responding to her elevated stress levels. Dr. Emily Harrison had warned her that continued stress could lead to premature labor, but the alternative, backing down and allowing Rick to escape consequences for his actions, felt like a betrayal of every woman who'd ever been victimized by his violence. There's something I need to tell you, Kate said suddenly, a memory surfacing that she'd previously dismissed as unimportant. Rick has been asking me about my father's cases for months. Not just casual questions, specific, detailed inquiries about pending Supreme Court decisions. Margaret Sterling and Detective Morrison exchanged meaningful glances. What kind of questions, Catherine? About reproductive rights cases, corporate liability decisions, anything that might affect business regulations. He always framed it as wanting to understand my father's work. But now I think he was trying to get inside information about Supreme Court deliberations. Sarah Beth stopped taking notes and looked directly at Kate. If Rick has been using his marriage to you as a means of accessing confidential information about Supreme Court proceedings, we're not just talking about domestic violence anymore. We're talking about attempted judicial corruption. Detective Morrison's radio crackled, and he stepped away to take a call. When he returned, his expression was even more serious than before. That was the FBI. Rick's business associates have started contacting federal prosecutors, claiming they have information about improper communications between Supreme Court justices and outside parties. The implications hit Kate like a physical blow. He's trying to destroy my father's career. It appears that way, Morrison confirmed. Rick is using his network of corporate attorneys and business connections to create the impression that Justice Sterling has been sharing confidential information with family members who then pass it along to interested parties. Margaret Sterling stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. This is unconscionable. Rick is willing to destroy the integrity of the Supreme Court itself to avoid facing consequences for hitting his pregnant wife. It gets worse, Sarah Beth said, consulting her notes. Rick's attorneys have scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning. They're planning to present him as the victim of a politically motivated attack by the Sterling family, using his wife as a pawn in a larger game of judicial manipulation. Kate felt overwhelmed by the scope of Rick's strategy. He wasn't just defending himself against assault charges. He was launching a comprehensive attack designed to destroy her credibility, her family's reputation, and potentially her father's judicial career. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah Beth gathered the legal documents with efficient movements. "We fight on every front. We protect Jennifer Walsh. We document Rick's pattern of abuse and intimidation. We expose his business practices. And we prepare for a very public battle that will test every principle your family holds dear." Detective Morrison stood to leave. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to understand something. What happens in the next few weeks won't just determine the outcome of your case. It will set precedent for how the justice system handles domestic violence cases involving powerful perpetrators who have the resources to wage legal warfare against their victims." As they prepared to leave the conference room, Kate felt the baby shift inside her, a reminder that she was fighting not just for herself, but for the next generation. Whatever Rick's strategy, whatever resources he brought to bear, she had something he didn't: the truth, and a family who understood that justice sometimes required sacrifice. The war was just beginning, but Kate finally understood the stakes. This wasn't about her marriage anymore. It was about whether wealth and power could override justice, whether victims could be silenced through intimidation and manipulation, and whether the law truly applied equally to everyone. She was ready to find out. Kate woke up to find news vans lined up along her quiet residential street like military vehicles preparing for siege. Her graduation assault video had gone viral overnight, shared across every major social media platform, with the hashtag #ChashinJusticeForKate trending nationally. She peered through the bedroom curtains of her childhood home, where she'd been staying since filing the restraining order against Rick 3 days earlier. Reporters with microphones stood on the sidewalk. Camera crews adjusted their equipment, and neighbors she'd known her entire life were being approached for interviews about the Sterling family. "Catherine, don't look at the news coverage," Margaret Sterling called from downstairs. "Sarah Beth is on her way over, and she says Rick's press conference is scheduled for 10 o'clock. But Kate couldn't resist checking her phone. The video had been viewed over 2 million times on various platforms, with comments ranging from supportive messages for domestic violence survivors to conspiracy theories about Supreme Court politics. Someone had created a timeline of Rick's business dealings alongside her father's judicial decisions, looking for connections that didn't exist. The worst part wasn't the public scrutiny. It was seeing her private trauma reduced to clickbait headlines and political commentary. "Supreme Court Justice's daughter assaulted at graduation, competed with corporate CEO claims political setup for views and engagement." Dr. Emily Harrison arrived at the house before Sarah Beth, her medical bag and concerned expression immediately focusing on Kate's well-being. "How are you holding up? Any contractions? Changes in the baby's movement?" Kate submitted to the examination, grateful for Dr. Harrison's calm professionalism amid the media chaos outside. "The baby's moving normally, but I feel like I can't breathe sometimes. Everything is happening so fast. Your blood pressure is elevated, which is concerning at this stage of pregnancy," Dr. Harrison said, making notes in Kate's chart. "The stress from this situation could trigger premature labor. We need to consider ways to minimize your exposure to additional trauma." Sarah Beth arrived with Detective Morrison and a woman Kate didn't recognize. A tall, elegant African-American woman in her 50s, wearing the kind of understated but expensive clothing that suggested success in high-stakes professional situations. "Kate, this is Victoria Hamilton," Sarah Beth said. "She's a crisis communications specialist who works with high-profile legal cases. Given the media attention this situation has generated, we need professional help managing the narrative." Victoria Hamilton assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd handled media circuses before. "The good news is that public opinion is overwhelmingly on your side. Domestic violence advocates, women's rights groups, and legal ethics organizations are all supporting you. The bad news is that Rick's team is about to launch a very sophisticated counter-narrative." She opened her laptop and showed them preliminary coverage from Rick's press conference preparation. "They're framing this as a story about political corruption and judicial bias. Rick is positioning himself as a successful businessman who married into a powerful legal family and discovered evidence of improper influence peddling at the highest levels of government." Detective Morrison looked disgusted. "So he's claiming that assaulting his pregnant wife was somehow justified by his concerns about Supreme Court corruption?" "Not justified," Victoria corrected. "He's claiming it never happened. His story is that Kate accidentally fell during her graduation speech, that he tried to help her, and that the Sterling family saw an opportunity to destroy him before he could expose their alleged corruption. Kate felt sick. But there's video evidence, hundreds of witnesses, which his attorneys are claiming shows nothing more than a concerned husband trying to steady his pregnant wife who stumbled while giving an emotional speech, Victoria explained. They have experts prepared to testify about camera angles, lighting conditions, and the unreliability of eyewitness testimony in emotionally charged situations. The audacity of Rick's strategy was breathtaking. He was using his wealth and legal resources not just to defend against the assault charges, but to completely rewrite reality itself. If he could convince enough people that the widely witnessed and recorded assault never happened, he could position himself as the victim of a conspiracy rather than the perpetrator of violence. Sarah Beth spread additional documents across the coffee table. It gets worse. Rick's business associates have started a coordinated social media campaign questioning your father's judicial integrity. They're suggesting that Justice Sterling has been sharing confidential information about pending cases with family members who have business interests. Justice Sterling entered the room at that moment, looking older than Kate had ever seen him. The strain of the past week, watching his daughter be assaulted, seeing his own integrity questioned, facing potential ethical challenges to his judicial career, had taken a visible toll on the distinguished jurist. I've been consulting with the Chief Justice about the ethical implications of my involvement in this case, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. There are those who believe I should recuse myself from all pending cases until this matter is resolved. Daddy, no, Kate protested. You can't let Rick destroy your career because he hit me. Justice Sterling sat beside his daughter, taking her hand with the gentle care he'd shown when she was a child with scraped knees and hurt feelings. Catherine, my career is not more important than your safety and the principle that no one is above the law. But I also have a responsibility to the court and to the cases pending before us that affect millions of Americans. Detective Morrison's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Rick's press conference just started. He's broadcasting live on all major networks. Victoria Hamilton pulled up the live stream on her laptop, and they watched in stunned silence as Rick, flanked by expensive attorneys and crisis management specialists, presented his version of events to the world. I married Catherine Sterling because I loved her, not because of her family connections, Rick said, looking directly into the cameras with practiced sincerity. But over the past 2 years, I've witnessed disturbing conversations between my wife and her father about pending Supreme Court cases that could affect American businesses and the economy. Kate watched her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, lying with the smooth confidence of someone who'd built a career on manipulating perceptions and controlling narratives. He looked wounded, concerned, and completely believable. The incident at my wife's graduation was a tragic accident that occurred when Catherine became dizzy during her speech, and I rushed to help her, Rick continued. The Sterling family immediately saw an opportunity to silence me before I could report my concerns about judicial impropriety to the appropriate authorities. The reporters at the press conference asked pointed questions about the video evidence and witness testimony, but Rick's attorneys deflected each inquiry with references to ongoing investigations and the need to protect the integrity of the judicial system. This is incredible, Margaret Sterling said, her prosecutor's training helping her see through Rick's strategy. He's admitting to having concerns about judicial impropriety, which gives him a motive to record conversations and monitor Catherine's communications. He's turning his stalking and surveillance into evidence of his civic responsibility. Sarah Beth was already taking notes for their response strategy. He's also created reasonable doubt about the assault. If even 5% of potential jurors believe his version of events, it becomes much harder to secure a conviction. Victoria Hamilton closed the laptop and turned to face the group. We need to respond immediately and aggressively. Rick is counting on the fact that lies spread faster than truth, especially when they're wrapped in concerns about political corruption and judicial integrity. Dr. Harrison checked Kate's blood pressure again and frowned at the reading. I'm concerned about the impact this stress is having on both you and the baby. We're at 36 weeks now. Stress-induced labor is a real possibility. The timing couldn't be worse. If Kate went into labor now, while Rick was successfully spinning his narrative to the public, it would provide him with additional ammunition, for his claims that she was emotionally and physically unstable. "What do we do?" Kate asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of Rick's attack on her family and her reality. Victoria Hamilton's expression was determined. "We tell the truth, and we tell it better than he tells his lies. But it's going to require you to go public, Kate. You'll need to give interviews, make statements, allow yourself to be seen as a real person rather than a political pawn." Justice Sterling squeezed his daughter's hand. "Catherine, whatever you decide, your mother and I will support you completely. But you need to understand that fighting Rick publicly will mean sacrificing any hope of privacy or normal life for you and your baby." Kate looked around the room at the people who'd committed themselves to seeking justice for what Rick had done to her. Her family, her legal team, law enforcement, even medical professionals, they were all willing to fight for the principle that domestic violence was unacceptable, regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or social status. "Schedule the interviews," she said quietly. "If Rick wants to make this a public battle about truth versus lies, then let's make sure the truth has the best possible chance of winning." Outside, the news vans continued their vigil, waiting for the next development in a story that had captured national attention. Inside, a young woman prepared to fight not just for justice, but for the right to define her own reality in the face of a powerful man's attempts to rewrite history itself. The media storm was just beginning, but Kate was no longer willing to be swept away by it. Rick's own mother, Eleanor Blackwood, arrived unannounced at the Sterling family home 2 days after Rick's press conference. The 70-year-old woman stood on the front porch with perfectly styled gray hair, expensive but understated clothing, and eyes that held decades of carefully concealed pain. "I need to speak with Catherine," Eleanor said when Margaret Sterling opened the door. "I have something that will destroy my son's case, but using it will destroy our family forever." Margaret led Eleanor into the living room, where Kate was resting under doctor's orders, her pregnancy now at 37 weeks and her stress levels still dangerously high. Detective Morrison and Sarah Beth Coleman had been called to the house for what Eleanor described as urgent testimony that changes everything. Eleanor Blackwood was not the woman Kate had expected, based on Rick's descriptions of his mother. Instead of the weak, manipulated woman Rick had portrayed, Eleanor carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd survived decades of psychological warfare while maintaining her outward composure. "Catherine, I owe you an apology," Eleanor began, her voice steady but filled with regret. "I've watched my son treat you the same way his father treated me for 40 years, and I said nothing because I was afraid of what Richard would do if I interfered." Detective Morrison leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you saying you witnessed a pattern of abusive behavior from your son toward his wife?" Eleanor opened her expensive handbag and removed a small digital recording device. "I'm saying I documented it. For 2 years, I've been recording Richard's phone calls to me where he complained about Catherine's behavior, described his methods of controlling her, and detailed his plans to use their marriage to gain access to Supreme Court information." The room fell silent as the implications of Eleanor's statement sank in. Rick's own mother had been building a case against him, collecting evidence of his abuse and potentially criminal behavior. "Why?" Kate asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you record your own son?" Eleanor's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the pain beneath. "Because I spent 40 years married to Richard's father, and I watched my son learn every single technique of psychological abuse and control from a master practitioner. I swore that if I ever had the chance to stop the cycle, I would take it." Sarah Beth Coleman activated her own recording device with Eleanor's permission. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to understand that anything you tell us could be used in legal proceedings against your son. Are you certain you want to proceed?" Eleanor nodded firmly. "I'm 70 years old, Ms. Coleman. I've spent my entire adult life protecting men who didn't deserve protection while watching them destroy women who did. I'm ready to tell the truth." She pressed play on her digital recorder, and Rick's voice filled the room with chilling clarity. "Mother, Catherine is becoming a problem. She thinks graduating law school makes her independent, but she needs to understand that I control every aspect of our life together. The money, the house, even access to her precious father. It all goes through me." Eleanor's voice on the recording was carefully neutral. "Richard, marriage is supposed to be a partnership." "Partnership?" Rick's laugh was cold and calculating. Catherine is an investment mother. Her father's position on the Supreme Court makes her valuable, but only if she understands her place in the relationship. I've been recording our conversations for months to document her emotional instability. If she ever tries to leave me or cause problems, I'll have her declared mentally unfit and take custody of our child. Sinoid. The recording continued with Rick detailing his strategies for isolating Kate from her friends, monitoring her communications, and using her pregnancy to make her financially and emotionally dependent on him. Most disturbing were his casual references to information he'd gathered about pending Supreme Court cases through his conversations with Kate. Detective Morrison stopped the playback. "Mrs. Blackwood, how many of these recordings do you have?" 47 phone conversations over the past 18 months, Eleanor replied. "Richard calls me every Sunday to complain about his life and plan his strategies for controlling the people around him. I realized early in his marriage to Catherine that he was escalating toward violence, just like his father did with me." Margaret Sterling had remained silent during the recording, but now she spoke with the controlled anger of someone who'd prosecuted domestic violence cases for 20 years. "Eleanor, what happened to you during your marriage? What did Rick's father do?" Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she reached into her purse again, withdrawing a small photo album. "Robert Blackwood broke my ribs twice, fractured my wrist, and gave me a concussion that required hospitalization. But the physical violence was nothing compared to the psychological torture. He convinced me that I was worthless, that no one would believe me if I spoke out, and that my children would be taken away if I tried to leave." She opened the photo album to reveal medical records, hospital photos, and documentation spanning 4 decades of systematic abuse. "I kept records because I thought someday I might find the courage to leave, but I never did. Robert died 3 years ago, and I thought the nightmare was over. Then I watched Richard begin using the same techniques on Catherine that his father had perfected on me." Kate struggled to process what she was hearing. The grandmother-to-be of her child had endured 4 decades of abuse and had been documenting Rick's behavior to prevent history from repeating itself. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah Beth said carefully, "your testimony in these recordings could be crucial evidence in both the assault case and the investigation into your son's business practices. But I need you to understand that testifying against Rick will likely result in permanent estrangement from your son and potentially put you at risk of retaliation." Eleanor's smile was sad but determined. "Ms. Coleman, I'm 70 years old and I have terminal cancer. The doctors give me 6 months to a year. I'd rather spend my remaining time trying to protect my daughter-in-law and grandchild than maintaining a relationship with a man who's become everything I despised about his father." The revelation about Eleanor's terminal diagnosis added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Rick's mother was using her final months to break a generational cycle of abuse, but her death would eliminate a key witness in any legal proceedings. Detective Morrison's phone buzzed with an urgent message. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to inform you that Rick has discovered you're here. He's on his way to this address with his security team, and he's making threats about family loyalty and consequences for betrayal." Eleanor's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "Then we need to work quickly. Detective Morrison, I have copies of all the recordings, Rick's business correspondence that shows his attempts to influence judicial proceedings, and documentation of his surveillance of his first wife, Jennifer Walsh." "You know about Jennifer?" Kate asked, surprised. "Richard told me about the baby that died," Eleanor said quietly. "He was proud of it. He said Jennifer learned what happened when wives tried to leave their husbands. He described it as a teaching moment." Hodorina, the casual cruelty of Rick's attitude toward Jennifer's tragedy and the death of his first unborn child revealed a level of sociopathy that went far beyond typical domestic violence. This wasn't a man who lost control in moments of anger. This was someone who used violence as a calculated tool to maintain power and control. Sarah Beth was already on her phone coordinating with law enforcement. "We need Eleanor in protective custody immediately, and we need to fast-track the analysis of these recordings. If Rick is willing to threaten his own dying mother to maintain his cover story, there's no limit to what he might do to intimidate other witnesses." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the street outside. Through the window, they could see Rick approaching the house with two men who looked like private security or corporate investigators. Eleanor stood up with surprising strength for someone battling cancer. "Catherine, I want you to know that watching you find the courage to fight back has been the proudest moment of my life as Richard's mother. You're doing what I never could do." Detective Morrison was already coordinating with backup units, while Sarah Beth prepared to invoke legal protections for their elderly witness. Justice Sterling, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward with the full authority of his judicial position. "Eleanor," he said gently, "thank you for choosing to protect my daughter and grandchild. Your courage in breaking this cycle will save lives." Outside, Rick's voice could be heard demanding entry to the Sterling family home, his tone alternating between false concern for his pregnant wife and barely controlled rage at his mother's betrayal. But inside, the truth was finally being documented and preserved by people who understood that some silences are more dangerous than any truth. Eleanor Blackwood had spent 40 years as a victim of domestic violence. In her final months, she was choosing to become a survivor and protector instead. The cost would be enormous, but the principle was simple. No more women would suffer what she had suffered if she could prevent it. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and Rick was about to discover that his own family's loyalty had limits that his cruelty had finally exceeded. "Your Honor," Sarah Beth Coleman announced as she stood before Judge Theodore Brennan 6 weeks later, "we're not just seeking justice for domestic violence. We're exposing a pattern of abuse that spans decades and multiple victims." The courtroom was packed with media representatives, domestic violence advocates, legal observers, and curious spectators drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. Kate sat at the plaintiff's table, her 6-week-old daughter, Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the surrounding chaos. The baby's presence served as a powerful reminder of what was at stake in these proceedings. Rick sat at the defense table flanked by 3 expensive attorneys, his expression carefully controlled, but his frequent glances toward Kate and the baby revealing his frustration at losing control of the narrative. Eleanor Blackwood's recordings had been ruled admissible evidence despite his legal team's vigorous objections, and Jennifer Walsh's testimony via secure video link had been devastatingly effective. Judge Brennan, a colleague of Justice Sterling's, but with no personal relationship to the family, had been selected specifically to avoid any appearance of judicial bias. His reputation for fairness and his experience with complex domestic violence cases made him an ideal choice for proceedings that would likely set important legal precedents. Detective Morrison took the witness stand first, presenting the evidence methodically and professionally. "Your Honor, our investigation revealed a pattern of escalating abuse spanning nearly a decade. The defendant used his wealth and corporate resources to stalk and intimidate his first wife, Jennifer Walsh, for 7 years after their divorce. He systematically isolated and psychologically abused the victim, Catherine Sterling, throughout their 2-year marriage. And he attempted to use his relationship with a Supreme Court justice's daughter to gain access to confidential judicial information." Rick's lead attorney, Marcus Webb, a silver-haired veteran of corporate defense cases, rose for cross-examination. "Detective Morrison, isn't it true that all of your so-called evidence of stalking and intimidation consists of unsubstantiated claims by a mentally unstable ex-wife and secret recordings made by a dying woman with a documented history of psychiatric treatment?" It was exactly the kind of attack on victim credibility that domestic violence advocates had warned about. But Detective Morrison had prepared for these tactics. "Mr. Webb, Jennifer Walsh's mental health treatment was specifically related to trauma from domestic violence, including the loss of her unborn child due to physical assault by your client. Eleanor Blackwood's recordings were made over 18 months and show clear evidence of premeditation and systematic abuse. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent a documented pattern of criminal behavior." The prosecution had built their case carefully, presenting evidence in a logical progression that painted an undeniable picture of Rick's true character. Financial records showed his use of corporate resources to monitor Jennifer Walsh's activities. Phone records documented his surveillance of Kate's communications. The graduation ceremony video, enhanced by FBI forensic specialists, clearly showed the deliberate nature of his assault on his pregnant wife. But Rick's defense team had resources of their own, and they weren't simply denying the charges. They were constructing an alternative reality where Rick was the victim of a politically motivated conspiracy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Marcus Webb said during his opening statement, "my client, Richard Blackwood, is a successful businessman who made the mistake of marrying into one of America's most powerful legal families. When he discovered evidence of potential judicial impropriety involving Supreme Court Justice William Sterling, he became a target for destruction. It was a sophisticated strategy that played on public skepticism about political corruption while positioning Rick as a whistleblower rather than an abuser." Webb presented carefully edited portions of Eleanor's recordings that made Rick sound concerned about judicial ethics rather than planning systematic abuse. He brought in corporate colleagues who testified about Rick's character and business integrity. He even produced a psychiatrist who suggested that Kate's pregnancy hormones might have made her more likely to misinterpret normal marital tensions as abuse. The strategy might have worked if not for Eleanor Blackwood's testimony. Despite her terminal cancer diagnosis and obvious physical frailty, Eleanor took the witness stand with quiet determination. Sarah Beth guided her through decades of documented abuse, the careful records she'd kept, and her decision to protect her daughter-in-law and grandchild from the violence that had defined her own marriage. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah Beth asked, "why did you wait 40 years to report the abuse you suffered?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "Because I believed what my husband told me, that no one would believe me, that I deserved what happened to me, and that speaking out would only make things worse. I watched my son learn those same techniques of control and intimidation, and I realized that my silence had helped create another abuser." Marcus Webb's cross-examination of Eleanor was aggressive and clearly calculated to discredit her testimony by suggesting her terminal illness had affected her mental capacity. But Eleanor had prepared for this attack with the help of her own physicians, who confirmed that her cognitive function remained completely intact despite her physical decline. The most devastating moment came when Eleanor played one of Rick's recorded phone calls where he bragged about Jennifer Walsh's miscarriage. "Mother, Jennifer learned what happens when women try to leave their husbands. Catherine needs to understand that lesson too, especially now that she's carrying my child." The courtroom fell completely silent as Rick's own words revealed his true character. Several jurors were visibly disturbed by the casual cruelty in his tone, and the defense team's attempts to claim the recording was taken out of context seemed weak and desperate. Jennifer Walsh's video testimony from her secure location provided additional confirmation of Rick's pattern of abuse. Despite Marcus Webb's attempts to discredit her as mentally unstable, her detailed account of Rick's escalating violence and her description of the assault that killed her unborn child was compelling and consistent with medical records from her hospitalization. "Mr. Blackwood didn't just push me down the stairs," Jennifer testified via secure video link. "He told me afterward that if I ever tried to leave him again, he would make sure I lost everything. My reputation, my financial security, even my life if necessary. I believed him then, and I believe him now." The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming, but Rick's defense team had one final strategy that caught everyone by surprise. They produced Kate's college roommate, Sandra Phillips, who testified that Kate had struggled with anxiety and depression during law school and had made statements about her father's Supreme Court cases that suggested she was sharing confidential information with her husband. It was exactly the kind of character assassination that domestic violence survivors feared most, using their private struggles and vulnerabilities against them in legal proceedings. Sandra's testimony implied that Kate was emotionally unstable and had been improperly sharing judicial information with Rick, which supported his claims of being concerned about judicial ethics. Sarah Beth's cross-examination of Sandra was swift and brutal. "Ms. Phillips, how much money did the defendant pay you for this testimony?" Sandra's face flushed with embarrassment. "I wasn't paid. I was just asked to tell the truth about Catherine's behavior in law school." "The truth?" Sarah Beth produced financial records showing a $50,000 payment from one of Rick's corporate accounts to Sandra's personal bank account just 1 week before her testimony. "Is $50,000 your usual fee for telling the truth about former roommates?" The revelation that Rick had bribed a witness to testify against Kate was the final nail in his defense strategy. Even his own attorneys looked shocked by the evidence of witness tampering, and Judge Brennan immediately ordered a recess to consider contempt charges against the defense team. As they prepared to resume testimony, Kate felt baby Emma stirring in her arms. The 6-week-old had slept through most of the proceedings, but now she was waking up and would soon need to be fed. The timing seemed symbolic, new life demanding attention and care, while the legal system worked to hold accountable those who threatened the vulnerable. "Sarah Beth," Kate whispered, "I want to testify. I want the jury to hear from me directly about what Rick did and why it matters." Taking the witness stand as a new mother while testifying against her abusive ex-husband would be one of the most difficult things Kate had ever done. But she was ready to speak her truth, regardless of the personal cost. The battle for justice was entering its final phase, and Kate was determined that her voice would be heard above Rick's lies and manipulations. From her hospital bed where she'd given birth to Emma just 3 weeks earlier, Kate had made a decision that shocked everyone. "I'm not just fighting for custody, I'm pressing federal charges for conspiracy and racketeering based on Rick's systematic abuse of power." Now, taking the witness stand with her infant daughter in the courthouse nursery nearby, Kate faced the most important testimony of the entire case. The federal investigation had expanded beyond domestic violence into a complex web of corporate corruption, witness intimidation, and attempted judicial manipulation that could send Rick to prison for decades rather than months. U.S. Attorney Patricia Vance, who had taken over the federal aspects of the prosecution, guided Kate through her testimony with the skill of someone who'd spent 15 years prosecuting organized crime cases. The scope of Rick's criminal enterprise was far broader than anyone had initially realized. "Mrs. Sterling," Attorney Vance said, using Kate's maiden name, which she'd resumed after the divorce, "can you describe how your ex-husband used your relationship with Supreme Court Justice William Sterling to gain access to confidential judicial information?" Kate's voice was steady despite the emotional weight of her testimony. "Rick would ask me seemingly casual questions about my father's work, which cases he was considering, how he was likely to vote, what discussions were happening among the justices. At first, I thought he was just interested in my family's work, but over time, I realized he was systematically gathering intelligence about Supreme Court deliberations. The federal prosecutors had uncovered evidence that Rick had been sharing this information with corporate clients and business associates, essentially selling access to Supreme Court intelligence through his marriage to a justice's daughter. SEC investigations had revealed suspicious trading patterns in several corporations that corresponded directly with Rick's access to advance information about pending judicial decisions. Marcus Webb rose for cross-examination, but his usual aggressive tactics were complicated by the presence of federal prosecutors and the overwhelming evidence of his client's criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Sterling, isn't it possible that you misinterpreted your husband's natural interest in current legal affairs as something more sinister?" Kate had prepared for this question with the help of her legal team. "Mr. Webb, my ex-husband recorded our private conversations for 18 months and used those recordings to build a case that I was mentally unstable. He monitored my phone calls, emails, and text messages. He isolated me from friends and family members who might have questioned his behavior. This wasn't casual interest. It was systematic intelligence gathering and psychological manipulation." The federal case had transformed Rick from a domestic violence defendant into the target of a major organized crime investigation. FBI financial analysts had traced millions of dollars in suspicious transactions connected to Rick's corporate network. Wiretaps authorized under federal racketeering statutes had captured conversations between Rick and his associates, discussing ways to intimidate witnesses and manipulate legal proceedings. Detective Morrison, now working with federal agents, presented evidence that Rick had been using corporate resources to conduct surveillance not just on Jennifer Walsh and Kate, but on several other individuals connected to Supreme Court cases that affected his business interests. "Your Honor," Detective Morrison testified, "the defendant established what amounts to a criminal enterprise designed to corrupt judicial proceedings through intimidation, bribery, and the systematic gathering of confidential information. This goes far beyond domestic violence. It represents a direct attack on the integrity of our legal system." The most damaging evidence came from Rick's own business associates, several of whom had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges in their own cases. Corporate executive Michael Torres testified about meetings where Rick bragged about his access to Supreme Court information and discussed strategies for influencing judicial decisions through pressure on Justice's family members. Rick told us that marrying Catherine Sterling was the best business decision he'd ever made, Torres testified. He said Justice Sterling's position gave him inside information worth millions of dollars in trading advantages and regulatory insights. Rick's defense team was falling apart under the weight of federal prosecution resources. Marcus Webb had been replaced by a team of white-collar criminal defense specialists, but even they seemed overwhelmed by the scope of evidence against their client. The turning point came when Eleanor Blackwood, despite her deteriorating health, insisted on testifying about Rick's plans to use baby Emma as a leverage against Kate and her family. The elderly woman's appearance on the witness stand was heartbreaking. She was obviously dying, but her determination to protect her granddaughter gave her strength to continue. Richard told me that having Catherine's baby gave him permanent leverage over the Sterling family. Eleanor testified, her voice barely audible, but her words carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. He said Justice Sterling would have to be careful about his judicial decisions because Richard could always threaten to disappear with the baby if the family caused him problems. The implication that Rick had been planning to kidnap his own child as leverage against a Supreme Court justice represented the kind of criminal conspiracy that federal prosecutors rarely encountered. It transformed the case from domestic violence into potential domestic terrorism. But Rick's legal team had one final surprise that threatened to derail the entire prosecution. They produced illegally obtained copies of Kate's private medical records, including psychiatric evaluations from her college years and details about her pregnancy that were meant to be confidential. Your Honor, Rick's new lead attorney announced, these medical records show that Mrs. Sterling has a documented history of mental health issues that make her testimony unreliable. More importantly, they reveal that she discussed her father's judicial work with her psychiatrist, which represents a breach of Supreme Court confidentiality protocols. It was exactly the kind of desperate, unethical maneuver that domestic violence survivors feared most, using their private medical information and mental health struggles against them in legal proceedings. Sarah Beth Coleman immediately moved for sanctions against the defense team for obtaining sealed medical records illegally. Judge Brennan was visibly angry about the breach of medical privacy. Counselor, how did your team obtain sealed medical records that should have been protected under federal privacy laws? The question exposed another layer of Rick's criminal enterprise. His investigators had been breaking federal laws to obtain confidential information about his ex-wife, her family, and anyone else who might testify against him. U.S. Attorney Vance used the illegal medical records as evidence of additional federal crimes. Your Honor, the defendant's systematic violation of privacy laws and illegal surveillance activities represent continuing criminal enterprise that poses a threat to anyone who opposes his interests. As the federal case expanded to include charges of illegal surveillance, medical records theft, and violation of federal privacy laws, Rick's situation became increasingly desperate. His corporate empire was collapsing as business partners fled the scandal. His legal bills were mounting into the millions, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. But Kate wasn't interested in Rick's financial destruction. She wanted justice for the pattern of abuse that had nearly destroyed her life and threatened the safety of her daughter. When she concluded her testimony, she looked directly at Rick for the first time since the trial began. "I married you because I thought you loved me," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "But you never loved me. You saw me as an investment opportunity and a source of power. What you did to me at graduation wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of 2 years of systematic abuse designed to break my spirit and make me compliant with your criminal enterprise." The federal jury would deliberate for 3 days before returning verdicts on dozens of charges ranging from domestic violence to racketeering conspiracy. But regardless of the outcome, Kate had already won the most important victory. She had found her voice, protected her daughter, and helped expose a criminal enterprise that had been operating in the shadows of America's legal system. The fight for everything had become a fight for justice itself, and Kate was no longer afraid of ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Federal prosecutor Patricia Vance began her closing argument 3 months after the trial began. This case isn't about one slap at a graduation ceremony. It's about a man who believed his wealth and power put him above the law, even when that law was represented by a Supreme Court justice. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching live broadcasts in adjacent rooms. What had begun as a domestic violence case had evolved into one of the most significant federal corruption prosecutions in recent memory. Rick faced 47 separate charges ranging from domestic violence and witness tampering to racketeering conspiracy and attempted corruption of federal judicial proceedings. Kate sat in the front row holding 4-month-old Emma, surrounded by the team of advocates, attorneys, and law enforcement officials who had fought alongside her for justice. Eleanor Blackwood sat beside her in a wheelchair, her cancer having progressed rapidly during the trial proceedings, but her determination to see justice done keeping her present for the verdict. Rick's defense team had spent millions of dollars on expert witnesses, character testimony, and sophisticated legal strategies, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. FBI surveillance had captured him discussing plans to flee the country with Emma if the trial went badly. Corporate investigations had revealed bribes paid to court officials, illegal surveillance of federal judges' families, and systematic attempts to manipulate stock prices using confidential Supreme Court information. The defendant created a criminal enterprise, prosecutor Vance continued, that used domestic violence as its foundation and judicial corruption as its goal. He didn't just abuse his wife, he used that abuse as part of a broader conspiracy to corrupt the highest court in our nation. Marcus Webb, who had returned to lead Rick's defense after his replacement proved ineffective, made a final desperate argument that his client was being prosecuted for domestic violence that should have been handled in state court, not federal conspiracy charges that carried decades in prison. Richard Blackwood made mistakes in his marriage, Webb argued, but mistakes are not conspiracies, and personal failings are not federal crimes. The government is using domestic relations law to prosecute what they claim is organized crime. But the evidence told a different story. Financial records showed Rick had spent over $2 million on illegal surveillance and intimidation activities. Recorded conversations revealed his plans to use Emma as leverage against Justice Sterling's judicial decisions. Most damaging of all were Rick's own words, captured on Eleanor's recordings, describing his systematic abuse of both Jennifer Walsh and Kate as necessary tools for maintaining control over women who might threaten his interests. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Jennifer Walsh appeared in person to testify, having finally gained enough courage to face Rick directly rather than testifying via video link. 7 years after losing her baby due to Rick's violence, she stood in the witness box and described the full scope of his abuse with devastating clarity. Richard Blackwood didn't just kill my unborn child, Jennifer testified, her voice steady despite visible trembling. He spent 7 years hunting me, tracking my movements, and making sure I knew that speaking out about what he did would result in my complete destruction. I lived in constant fear until I learned about what he was doing to Catherine. That's when I realized that my silence was enabling him to destroy another woman and another baby. Rick's reaction to Jennifer's testimony revealed the extent of his narcissistic rage. He was caught on courtroom cameras mouthing threats toward Jennifer while she spoke, behavior that Judge Brennan immediately cited as evidence of continuing criminal conduct. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Brennan said sternly, "your behavior in this courtroom demonstrates exactly the kind of intimidation and abuse that brought us here today. You will remain silent during testimony, or you will be removed from these proceedings." The federal jury deliberated for 4 days, reviewing hundreds of pieces of evidence and dozens of hours of testimony. During the wait, Kate spent time with Emma in the courthouse nursery, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while the legal system determined whether Rick would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Eleanor Blackwood used the time to complete her final testimony for a documentary about generational domestic violence that would be released after her death. Despite her failing health, she was determined to ensure that other women understood the warning signs of systematic abuse and the importance of breaking cycles of violence. "I spent 40 years protecting a man who didn't deserve protection," Eleanor said in her final recorded interview. "I won't spend my remaining months allowing my son to continue that pattern of abuse. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is hold her child accountable for the harm he causes others. Humor. Justice Sterling had recused himself from all Supreme Court cases pending the resolution of Rick's trial, but his colleagues had unanimously supported his decision to prioritize family safety over judicial responsibilities. The legal community had rallied around the principle that domestic violence represented a direct threat to judicial independence and the rule of law itself. When the jury returned with verdicts, the courtroom fell completely silent. Foreman Patricia Chen, a retired teacher who had been elected by her fellow jurors to deliver their decisions, read through 47 separate charges with careful deliberation. On the charge of domestic violence in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racketeering conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts continued for 20 minutes, with guilty findings on 45 of the 47 charges. The only acquittals were on 2 minor financial charges where the evidence had been less conclusive. Rick's face remained impassive throughout the reading, but his hands shook visibly as the weight of his convictions became clear. Judge Brennan scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, but legal observers estimated that Rick faced a minimum of 25 years in federal prison and potentially life imprisonment given the severity of his crimes and his lack of cooperation with investigators. The most satisfying moment for Kate came when federal marshals placed Rick in handcuffs and led him away to await sentencing. For 2 years, she had lived in fear of his anger, his control, and his threats. Now he was the one facing an uncertain future, while she held their daughter and planned for a life free from his influence. Eleanor Blackwood squeezed Kate's hand as they watched Rick being escorted from the courtroom. "It's over, dear. He can't hurt you or Emma or any other woman ever again." Outside the courthouse, media representatives and domestic violence advocates had gathered for what had become the most closely watched conclusion of a federal domestic violence prosecution in American history. Kate had prepared a brief statement with the help of Victoria Hamilton, but when she stepped up to the microphones, she spoke from her heart rather than from prepared remarks. Today's verdicts represent justice not just for me, but for every woman who has been told that domestic violence is a private matter that doesn't concern the legal system, Kate said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Rick Blackwood used his wealth and power to try to silence his victims and corrupt our courts, but justice won because brave people were willing to speak truth to power. She looked down at Emma, who was sleeping peacefully despite the noise and chaos around them. "My daughter will grow up in a world where domestic violence has consequences, where wealth and power don't provide immunity from accountability, and where women's voices are heard and believed." The press conference concluded with statements from federal prosecutors, domestic violence advocates, and legal experts about the broader implications of Rick's convictions. The case had established important precedents about federal prosecution of domestic violence cases involving systematic abuse and corruption of judicial proceedings. But for Kate, the most important outcome was simpler and more personal. She was free. Emma was safe. And the cycle of violence that had nearly destroyed 2 generations of women in Rick's family had finally been broken. As they walked away from the courthouse, Eleanor Blackwood looked up at her daughter-in-law with pride and satisfaction. "Catherine, you did what I never had the courage to do. You fought back, and you won." Oh. 6 weeks later, Rick would be sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His corporate empire would be dismantled to pay restitution to his victims and fund domestic violence prevention programs. His attempts to appeal the convictions would fail at every level, including a final rejection by the Supreme Court where Justice Sterling had recused himself from the case. But those victories lay in the future. For now, Kate simply walked away from the courthouse holding her daughter, surrounded by people who had fought for justice, and finally free to build the life she'd always imagined for herself and her child. The reckoning was complete, and the future belonged to the survivors. 6 months after Rick's sentencing, Kate stood at another podium, but this time she was addressing a congressional hearing on domestic violence legislation while holding her healthy 8-month-old daughter, Emma. The House Judiciary Committee had invited her to testify about the need for federal legislation addressing domestic violence cases involving systematic abuse and corruption. "Chairman Rodriguez, members of the committee," Kate began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had survived the worst and found her strength on the other side. My experience with domestic violence began like most, with isolation, control, and psychological manipulation. But it escalated into a federal criminal conspiracy because my abuser believed his wealth and power made him immune to consequences. The hearing room was packed with domestic violence advocates, legal experts, and media representatives covering what had become known as the Sterling Blackwood case. The federal convictions had created important legal precedents, but Kate's testimony was focused on preventing other women from enduring what she had experienced. Emma sat contentedly in her mother's lap, occasionally making small sounds that drew smiles from the usually serious congressional representatives. The baby's presence served as a powerful reminder of what was at stake in domestic violence cases. Not just the immediate victims, but future generations who deserve to grow up free from violence and fear. The system worked in my case because I had extraordinary resources, Kate continued. My father is a Supreme Court justice. My mother is a former prosecutor, and I had access to the best legal representation available. But most domestic violence victims don't have those advantages. They need federal legislation that provides consistent protection and prosecution standards regardless of geography, wealth, or political connections. Representative Maria Santos of California, who had championed federal domestic violence legislation for years, asked pointed questions about the intersection of domestic violence and judicial integrity. Mrs. Sterling, how did your abuser's attempts to corrupt judicial proceedings affect your father's ability to serve on the Supreme Court? Kate had anticipated this question and had discussed her response with Justice Sterling beforehand. Representative Santos, my father recused himself from multiple cases during the investigation and trial to avoid any appearance of judicial bias. But the real threat to judicial integrity comes from allowing abusers to use family relationships as tools for corruption. Federal legislation needs to address not just the violence itself, but the systematic abuse of legal and political connections. The proposed legislation, dubbed the Sterling Act, despite Kate's objections to having her name attached to it, would create federal jurisdiction for domestic violence cases involving public officials, systematic abuse patterns, or attempts to corrupt legal proceedings. It had bipartisan support from representatives who recognized that domestic violence could threaten the foundations of democratic governance. After her congressional testimony, Kate returned to her new life as a federal prosecutor specializing in domestic violence cases. The U.S. Attorney's Office had offered her a position immediately after Rick's conviction, recognizing her unique combination of legal training, personal experience, and public credibility in domestic violence cases. Her first case had involved a military contractor who was using his security clearance and government connections to intimidate and abuse his wife. The parallels to her own situation were obvious, but Kate had learned to channel her personal experience into professional advocacy rather than allowing it to overwhelm her. The defendant believed his position gave him immunity from consequences, she had argued in her opening statement. But domestic violence is domestic terrorism, and terrorism has no immunity under American law. The conviction had been swift and decisive, establishing Kate's reputation as a prosecutor who understood both the legal complexities and personal realities of domestic violence cases involving powerful perpetrators. Eleanor Blackwood had died peacefully in her sleep 3 months after Rick's sentencing, but not before seeing her granddaughter take her first steps and hearing her first words. Her final weeks had been spent establishing a foundation to support domestic violence survivors and fund research into generational patterns of abuse. Eleanor understood something that took me years to learn, Kate reflected during the Foundation's inaugural fundraising dinner. Breaking cycles of violence requires more than individual courage. It requires systemic change and community support. Her foundation will ensure that other women have the resources and support she never had when she needed them most. Justice Sterling had returned to his full duties on the Supreme Court after Rick's conviction, his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by his decision to prioritize family protection over judicial convenience. A profile in the Harvard Law Review described his handling of the crisis as a masterclass in judicial ethics and personal integrity. The legal community had embraced Justice Sterling's approach as a model for handling conflicts between judicial responsibilities and family emergencies. Several law schools had created case studies based on his decisions during the crisis, using them to teach future lawyers about the complexities of legal ethics in personal situations. Margaret Sterling had been appointed to head a new federal task force on domestic violence prevention, drawing on her prosecutorial experience and her personal understanding of how domestic violence affected legal families. Her first initiative was creating specialized training programs for law enforcement officers dealing with domestic violence cases involving public officials or legal professionals. Domestic violence doesn't respect professional boundaries or social status, Margaret told the inaugural class of federal domestic violence investigators, but it does exploit power imbalances and institutional weaknesses. Our job is to ensure that the legal system protects victims regardless of who their abusers might be. Jennifer Walsh had emerged from years of hiding to become a powerful advocate for domestic violence survivors, particularly those dealing with long-term stalking and intimidation by wealthy abusers. Her testimony in Rick's trial had been so compelling that she'd been invited to speak at conferences across the country about surviving systematic abuse. Rick Blackwood stole 7 years of my life through fear and intimidation, Jennifer told audiences. But watching Catherine Sterling fight back gave me the courage to reclaim my voice and help other women find theirs. The ripple effects of Rick's conviction continued to spread through corporate and legal communities. Several of his business associates had been indicted on related charges, and SEC investigations had uncovered widespread corruption involving the illegal use of confidential judicial information for financial gain. Rick himself had been transferred to a maximum security federal prison in Colorado, where he was serving his 35-year sentence in relative isolation. His appeals had been exhausted, his corporate empire had been liquidated to pay restitution to victims, and his attempts to maintain contact with Emma through prison correspondence had been blocked by court order. But the most important changes were personal ones. Kate had moved into a new house near her parents, creating a safe and stable environment for Emma, while maintaining her independence as a single mother and federal prosecutor. The house had a large garden where she planned to teach Emma to grow vegetables and flowers, creating beauty and sustenance from careful nurturing and patient work. Emma was thriving, showing no signs of the trauma that had surrounded her birth. She was walking confidently, beginning to speak in simple sentences, and displaying the kind of fearless curiosity that suggested she would grow up feeling safe and loved rather than controlled and intimidated. "She looks like you at that age," Justice Sterling observed during one of their regular Sunday dinners. "But she has a confidence that you had to fight to develop. She's growing up knowing she's safe and valued and heard." The observation was true. Emma was developing in an environment where women's voices were respected, where strength was celebrated rather than punished, and where love was demonstrated through support rather than control. She would never know the fear that had defined her mother's marriage, because that fear had been replaced by justice and healing. On the first anniversary of Rick's conviction, Kate stood once again at a graduation ceremony, this time Emma's first birthday party, surrounded by friends and family who had supported them through the darkest period of their lives. Dean Walsh, now retired, had attended with news that the law school was establishing a scholarship for domestic violence survivors in Kate's name. "I know you probably don't want your name on another program," Dean Walsh said with a smile, "but your courage inspired a generation of law students to understand that legal advocacy can literally save lives." As the party wound down and Emma fell asleep in her arms, Kate reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The graduation ceremony where Rick had struck her seemed like it had happened in another lifetime, to a different person who had accepted control and intimidation as the price of marriage and security. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true security came from justice, that real love was demonstrated through support rather than control, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear when the cause was just. Emma stirred in her arms, opening her eyes briefly to look up at her mother, with the kind of trust that came from being consistently protected and cherished. In those eyes, Kate saw not just her daughter's future, but the future of all the women who would benefit from the legal precedents, institutional changes, and cultural shifts that had emerged from their struggle. The perfect day had indeed been shattered by Rick's violence, but from the broken pieces, something stronger and more beautiful had emerged. Justice had been served, Cycles of violence had been broken, and a new generation was growing up in a world where domestic violence had consequences and women's voices were heard and believed. As the sun set on this anniversary of survival and justice, Kate held her daughter close and looked toward a future filled with possibilities that Rick's control had never been able to imagine or contain. They were free, they were safe, and they were home. The story that had begun with the crack of a hand against a face at a graduation ceremony had ended with the sound of a baby's laughter and the promise of justice for generations to come. Some endings are also beginnings, and some victories create the foundation for even greater triumphs yet to be won. In the quiet of evening, with Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, Kate Sterling knew that she had kept the most important promise she had ever made: to break the cycle of violence and create a world where her daughter could grow up fearless, valued, and free. The silence was no longer shattered. It had been replaced by something much more powerful: the sound of truth, justice, and new life beginning. If Catherine's story of courage and justice inspired you, hit that like button to support survivors of domestic violence. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters and that justice is possible, even against the most powerful opponents. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell, because stories like these remind us why truth and accountability matter more than wealth and power. Your support helps these important stories reach people who need hope and inspiration. What did you think of Catherine's incredible journey from victim to federal prosecutor? Let me know in the comments below.